Welcome to the 311 Griffin YouTube channel. Let's talk about Top Gun Maverick, or as I like to call it, Top Gun 2. This was a movie that is probably the most unrealistic military-based movie I've ever purchased because I actually genuinely like it. And for those people that know me really well, you'll know that that is extremely high praise for me. It is rare for me to see a movie that is this fake and actually enjoy it. Now, we're not going to talk in detail about the fakeness of the movie. There were some things that were really well done, but the bulk of the movie was just not realistic. And the primary purpose of this video is to talk about some of the details that I felt like they got wrong and some of the details they got right. And the purpose of that, of talking about those details, is to just go over some of the cool things that people may not know about F-18s or about this type of stuff. It's not necessarily to review the movie. We're just talking about those details. So let's get right into it. First off, the Cobra maneuver. Cobra maneuvers are a fun air show maneuver that some planes can do, but it's not a good fighting maneuver. No fighter jet pilot worth his salt would ever do the Cobra maneuver. The first problem with this is that the F-18 can't do a Cobra maneuver. That's the first problem with it. Here are some Saab Drakens that are doing the Cobra. Flankers and Fulcrums can do the Cobra maneuver. This is from DCS. This is a flanker. This is technically not a Cobra maneuver because I gained too much altitude. But right away, you'll see the first problem with doing a Cobra, and that is that you are departing from controlled flight and losing control of your aircraft, and that can result in a prolonged departure that is hard to recover from. But you are temporarily departing controlled flight, and that's usually not a good idea. Now, you can do it, but not a great idea most of the time. The bigger problem is that you're slowing your aircraft way down, and when it comes to fighting in fighter jets, energy is life, so you would never want to trade energy and get nothing in return. As you can see, the target up ahead, which is only doing 300 knots and is flying straight and level, I lost a lot of ground in the sim whenever I did that partial Cobra maneuver or near Cobra maneuver. So most of the time, a pilot that is any good is either going to shoot you when you try to do a Cobra maneuver, or is just going to fly in a way that takes whatever advantage you may have had, takes it away and gives them all the advantage, because now you're slow and you're nearly the same altitude, so you really got nothing in exchange for slowing down except for a very temporary position during which you had very little nose authority. So it's not a good maneuver. So next, let's talk about the acceleration. Now, first of all, F-18s and especially Super Hornets that are partially loaded really probably can't go this fast at that altitude. But the acceleration is the bigger problem. The time that it took him to get from 530 to 680 knots was a short enough period of time that that's more acceleration G than a top fuel dragster makes, which it was nearly 6 Gs. An F-18 launching off a carrier deck's probably pulling 3 to 4 Gs in acceleration. And in reality, it would take you over 15 seconds in a Legacy Hornet to accelerate that fast, I believe. The other problem with it is that you just can't maneuver that hard in a Hornet. If you're going really fast, if you're going 700 knots, you can only pull so many G. So you're not going to be able to turn very tight. So that scene was, I know that they were trying to abbreviate things and make it look pretty cool, but that scene was a little bit much. So next we've got the 10G climb. And the problem with this is that Hornets can't do 10 Gs. You can do nearly 10 G. You could do 9.4 as they showed in that HUD if you override the G limit, depending on the configuration of the aircraft. The real problem, it wasn't necessarily the 10 Gs that I had with it. It's the fact that once you establish the climb, you're more or less 1 G. You're going to be around 1 G. Let's zoom in on this HUD and DCS here, and we'll just look at a couple things. First, we've got the total velocity vector. We're doing a little bit more than 70 degrees of climb. And we've done 9.1 G. That's the most we've done in this aircraft this flight. But currently we're at 0.3 G. Because once you establish the climb, you're not pulling the Gs. When you pull over the top, you will start to put some G on the aircraft again. But you are not still pulling G. So that's the biggest problem I had with that. The 10 Gs would have been relatively quick, and then once they established the climb, the G would have fallen off, and you'd be more or less around 1 G. All right, let's talk about the climb again. This time we're talking about going directly away from the target and using the targeting pod. So the targeting pods can slew around quite a bit, but in the movie it's very clear that they are flying almost directly away from the target, but the targeting pod still sees the target. And that's just not realistic. So here's my targeting pod. There are many like it, but this one is mine. You can see it has a couple lenses on it. And you can see based on the design of the aircraft that it can look directly back, but the body of the targeting pod will be blocking it or masking it, as they say, so you wouldn't be able to see the target back there. Next, we're going to talk about the way that Rooster dumb bombs. So freeze it here. What we have here is a total velocity vector. That's where the airplane's flying. That's the point that the airplane is going to be at some point in the future if you don't change the control inputs. He's going to crash this plane into that spot if he keeps flying. If you were to drop a bomb now, it would fall somewhere below that total velocity vector. Because bombs aren't airplanes, they don't have engines, they are subject to gravity. Let's look at a similar HUD in DCS, but with an actual bomb fall line and targeting solution. We still have the total velocity vector, but out from the bottom of that total velocity vector, we have what's called a bomb fall line. But at the bottom of them is in this case, the CCIP pipper, or the constantly computed impact point. And that is where the bombs are going to hit if we drop them at this exact instant. And you can see that it is well below the total velocity vector. So if we unpause the video, we kind of maneuver, put the point on the target, hit the weapon release button, the bombs fall off the plane. You notice that they fall based on gravity. They do have forward momentum, but they impact well below the total velocity vector. They could have put an actual CCIP cue in the HUD in the movie, and people would have understood what it meant. All right, let's talk about SAMs. Now, there is so much I could say about this scene or these scenes in the movie. The SAM scenes were kind of frustrating for a number of reasons. I don't necessarily want to go into a ton of detail because I don't know where I'd start and where I'd stop, but SAMs just don't really work this way. They don't fire like salvos of 6 of these missiles, and they don't track multiple targets. Now, there are some SAMs that can track multiple targets, but generally speaking, for SAMs like this that are on multiple rack launchers, you'd have a search radar and a track radar nearby that are connected to those or communicating with those. The radars would track, the search radar would go out and find targets of interest. The tracking radar would focus on one of those targets, typically speaking, and then they would fire 1 or 2 SAM missiles at that target. It depends on the SAM. There's a lot of variables. Depends on the seeker type. You wouldn't have this many SAMs concentrated in one location because they're expensive and you have to have people man them. Let's assume you did. You could have one radar looking at one target and one radar looking at another and track different targets and things like that. But you'd fire 1 or 2 missiles at a time. Now here in DCS, you'll see that launcher is tracking my target, fires 1 missile. The missiles aren't that hard to defeat. They have to lead the target, so you can kind of lead them into the ground. If you're set up correctly and have plenty of energy, they're usually not that hard to defeat. Now, in the movie, they were closer to the SAMs, or the SAMs were closer to the targets than this, so that is a pro and a con for both sides. Closer means that the missiles have more energy when they get to the terminal point, but the bad news is that the missiles and the radar have to slew faster because you're closer. So as you beam the radar or the missile, it would have to slew more to track your aircraft. So anyway, it's not the biggest deal in the world. The biggest problems I have with that scene is that they didn't dive back into valleys. If they would have got their jets back down into the valleys, it wouldn't have been an issue at all. And the movie still could have been cool because you could have had the 5th gen fighters, which, by the way, there were 6 in the movie by my count, and that's all the 5th gen fighters that have been made of that type, to my knowledge. They don't have a lot of them. you could have still had an interesting movie. Also, if I were the enemy in that movie, I would have put man pads down in those valleys. Guys with Strela launchers on their shoulders. They're relatively inexpensive, and they would have been destroying a lot of Hornets in that movie because they're passive IR guidance, and the Hornets wouldn't have ever known that they were there unless they happened to see the missile launch. So lots of problems with the SAM scenes. Not the end of the world. It was kind of exciting. I just wish that they would have made it a bit more realistic. So now let's talk about some good stuff in the movie. And there was a decent amount of good stuff. First up, the laser code, 1688. That's a real laser code. And these are actual GBU-12s, or at least they look like GBU-12s that are on the aircraft. Those details, accurate. Next, let's talk about Maverick's Valley Run scene where he's proving the mission is possible. This was a really cool scene. Despite the fact that they had too many scenes of people leaning forwards in their chairs and touching their faces, and they really tried to ruin this part for me. But when you watch this jet, there's wing flex, the front slats on the wings are activating, the ailerons are activating, you get vapor over the wings and over the leading edge root extensions. Maverick is he's fighting that harness, or that harness is keeping him in a spot, and he's looking where he needs to look. It's a really cool scene. That's my favorite scene of the movie by far. I tried to capture a slightly similar scene in DCS, but it's not quite as exciting in DCS as it was in the movie, but a great part of the movie. Now, there were some scenes where it was a little bit too CGI and too dumb. Like this death spiral scene between Rooster and Maverick was just dumb. That's not the way that fight would have played out, but that's okay. The last thing I really want to talk about is the FCS override switch, or the paddle switch. I should just call it the paddle switch. Now, it's not animated in the DCS Hornet. The pilot won't hit it. I'm using it at various times here while I fly. But what that does is it overrides the G limit of the aircraft. And if I remember right, it's typically 7.5 G. You can get 33% more. So you could get nearly 10 Gs out of a Hornet if you hit that switch and you're in the correct configuration. But I thought it was really cool that they put that in the movie, that they showed that detail. And that brings me to a bonus positive about the movie. And that is that every time they show a control, for the most part, there's one I can think of that was completely incorrect, and that was in the F-14. But aside from that, every time you see them, an up-close shot of them manipulating a control inside the cockpit of the aircraft, it's pretty realistic. In Top Gun, the first, it was always backwards. Whether it was the throttle or a switch on the stick to select weapons or whatever, it was always backwards. In Top Gun Maverick, it's always correct. The throttles are going the right direction. The weapon switches are going the right direction. The paddle switch is being used when it should be used. All of those control movements are the right direction and more or less at the right time. And that's really cool. That's a really cool feature of the movie that I really like. Those are the bad things and the good things that I thought were detailed enough and quick enough for me to talk about to sort of show off some of the stuff in this movie that was cool to watch. The secondary goal of this video was just to try to point out that we don't have to write lazy movies anymore. We don't have to cut corners necessarily. We can make them realistic and still make them really good movies. And I think that Maverick 2, while it was a really good movie, I think it missed an opportunity to be super realistic and super interesting at the same time. So it was very interesting, very good movie, very fun to watch. And that's a very good thing. But they just missed out on some of the realism. There's some realism there that is really cool. Some realism that they could have included that would have been really cool that they missed out on. And I don't think we have to choose between real and interesting anymore. I think we can have both. And I think that we need to demand both out of our movie writers and movie makers. So with that, I'm signing off. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. Take care.
I'm very good.